Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is my co-host and president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, Janell Blue. The society is our sponsor. Good morning, Janell. I understand that Mount Vernon has been working on a project dealing with the pandemic. What can you tell us about it?
Well, good morning, Chuck. Chuck, we are inviting our members to record their experiences during this pandemic. Wouldn't it have been nice if your ancestors had done that for you during the 1918? And in fact, for some of us, we do have a few clues about something that would have happened. I mean, we all have ancestors who lived during the 1918, but what happened to them? And did they leave stories? And if they left crumbs, should we look into those and write about it? So that's the project that we've got. It can be in all sorts of different expressions. It can be a poem, it can be a narrative, and we've got a lot of information on our website about that. So today I thought maybe it would be interesting for our viewers to kind of walk through writing something about your ancestor in 1918. And especially if you have a clue or you have a family story or something that, something to start with. So let's do that. And first of all, I'm going to set up a scenario for you. And in this scenario, we've got a few pieces of information. And the most important one is 2 young sisters died within 2 weeks of each other in 1918. So what does that say to you?
Not a normal thing to happen within families. I mean, yes, occasionally it does, but it's not the norm.
It's not the norm. They lived in the same household on a family farm. They were the only children at the time. So, we don't really can't look at other children to see, what happened to them. And it was a small community of about 100 people, sort of an enclave that was outside of a big city. So there's the scenario. And if I were going to formulate my opening paragraph, and I wanted to do it with a little bit of genealogical methodology in it, I would say basically 3 points. I would say, first of all, the background, what we just told you. Two young sisters died within 2 weeks of each other in 1918, and they lived on a farm, and there were no other children that were affected. Then your genealogical question is, did they die of the Spanish flu? And then that last the last sentence in that paragraph can be the conclusion, it can be a hint, it can be something that tells your reader what you're getting ready to say. All right, so we've set it up. Now you can start writing because you've already got your structure. So let's get going. What's the first question in your mind when I told you about that scenario?
Well, my first question, being someone who looks at records of death, was, what did the death certificate say?
Yes. Everybody.
Unfortunately, we know this is Texas, where they were slower than other parts of the country, and they weren't alone. They were not, one of the first to start recording vital records, not just deaths, but births and marriages.
Well, they were certainly, there was a statewide mandate by the time these children died.
Right.
But remember, there were a couple of things going on. It was World War I. There was probably not a lot of physicians in town. They may not have even had any. It may have been, like the traveling preachers. It might have been that sort of thing. And if they were, they probably weren't the modern medicine kind, because those guys were probably in the war. The other thing is, if there wasn't a doctor, was it diagnosed properly?
Well, and we know from, or at least I know from all the research I've done, there is the law and there is what happened.
Right.
New Jersey has the second oldest continual vital record starting in 1848, but I had a case that I did where I found the births in the 1870s, there were 4 children, boy, girl, boy, girl. The births of the 2 boys were registered, the girls were not.
Well, I'm afraid in
You
those
know,
days
so
they tells you something.
someone fell down on the job for
that.
one reason or another.
So there are no death certificates for these 2 children. And so then you might want to say, well, let's look at death certificates for that community in general. Let's just put that into Ancestry.com. 1918, put the community in, see how many death certificates come up. There were like 6. And there were none that said Spanish flu. There was one who had pneumonia, which might have associated. Who knows? But none of them were in that time range.
Well, and the other thing we also have to look at is medicine. They did not know as much as they know now. And I have a friend whose daughter is a medical examiner, and she has looked at death certificates and, said that's probably not really what happened, but they didn't know. They didn't have the test to, test to see what it really was.
Well,
so,
even if they did, they were looking for bacteria in those days. They weren't even thinking about a virus. There wasn't real, the medical community wasn't really focused on this because the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic happened in 3 waves. These children died in the first wave. Right. So people weren't even really paying attention then. They were still focused on gatherings to raise bonds for the war effort and other things. And it wasn't until much later that the health department began to put masks. This would have been in the fall by the time they got around to that. So you're right. They might not have even diagnosed it even if they... Okay, so no death certificate. And of course, we all know about church registers. And if you're lucky, the church survives. More than likely, it got blended in with somebody else's church, and the record may or may not be available. So there was, in this case...
Well, they were not necessarily really keeping a whole lot of details about deaths. People moving out of the area or that kind of thing, or if they're buried in the churchyard. But, I don't go to churches unless there's a cemetery among the first things that I look for when I'm looking into a death.
There could be the possibility, though, if there were a lot of people in that congregation who died from an epidemic, there could be some notation. It may not be like in the death register. It could be some other thing. But anyway, there was nothing here. We couldn't find the church. Family Bibles, sometimes there might be a notation. There was nothing there. There was no family Bible, actually. So then you're looking for obituaries, newspaper listings, county historic records. Well, they were in a small town, so they probably didn't spend the money to put an obituary in the big city paper, because that would have cost money. And they were poor farmers.
Well, and a lot of times with small communities, it might be a county newspaper as opposed to big city.
And those county newspapers I don't have access to those.
Well, and depending on what the county did with the newspaper, if they have the community sections. I have recently heard somebody in a genealogy conversation mention those kinds of things. But I grew up in an area where you go through those because there's lots of newsy news.
Yeah, there's a lot of almost gossip in there. So I went into the city newspapers. This is the city of Houston. I went into their newspapers, and in the spring, which is when these girls died, May, they weren't even talking about an epidemic then. They didn't really, weren't really that worried about it. The most information that I got was there was a military camp in the city called Camp Logan, and they were required to keep track of information So they described what was happening to the soldiers, how many had died, the whole thing. And it was probably the only place where those kinds of records were really kept, just because there were these groups of people and they were required. And then, of course, you can, broaden it, not just the household or not just the relatives, but the neighbors too. You could do that. I looked at the names of the people that I knew lived nearby, and I didn't really see anything. So there's no direct evidence that points me to the Spanish flu. So now what do we do? Well, there was a family story. And so when you're looking at a family story, you want to look at the source, the time distance, the facts, and the accuracy. So the source turned out to be the sister of these children. She was born after they died, and the mother told the sister. So the source is pretty good. I mean, it came from the mother, who obviously nursed these children and knew. And the sister, well, it was 80 years later when the sister told me about it. Mm-hmm. So there is quite a time distance, and that factors into stories. But actually, this particular woman had a very sharp mind right up into the last year of her death, and she loved details. Yes. She could tell you every medication and the scientific name of it, and she just was that sort of person. So I have a feeling she got the story right.
Well, and she didn't really have, sometimes we look at, is there a reason to spin a story one way or the other? And, she probably didn't have a reason for trying to spin it any other way.
No, but
her mother told her.
Right, but I said, I'm pretty sure they died of the Spanish flu, and she said, no, they didn't. And so then she told me the symptoms, which I hate to go into that in this, but they were more of a gastric nature. I mean, they were like violent gastric sorts of things. And we all know that the 1918 flu, it's kind of like this one. It was all respiratory. If you read anything about the 1918 flu, you're going to read about the respiratory problems. Mm-hmm. So here we have this disconnect. And so now what? So again, the gastric versus the respiratory, the age groups, and the first wave, most of the age groups were in that military age group, right? Because they were the only ones who were keeping records, really. These children were under 5. So that didn't really match.
What would the opportunity be for them to have really come into contact with someone who might be a carrier?
Well, that is a big question. And that was one of the reasons that I wanted to see if anyone else in the neighborhood had died too. Now, Camp Logan had this outbreak in the spring. Camp Logan was 30 miles away almost from this. So I doubt these people had a car.
Yeah, back in that time, and one of the things we really need to look at is car, roads, things like that, opportunities at that time. I find that people often equate things as they are today when they're looking back, and we had talked about this, so I'll share the story. I had someone who we happened to be on a trip out to the U.S. Geological Survey out in Reston, and she came up and she said to me she had pulled out a map in West Virginia where her great-grandparents lived up in the mountains, and there's the town that her great-grandfather was from, and 28 miles of road to get there today to get to where her great-grandmother was. And she said, I want to know how they met. And she said, 28 miles, I don't know. And I said, 28 miles, you're looking at a modern map. We
Yeah.
need to go back,
Right.
because chances are there were not the roads, there definitely were not the roads that you have today. So we were able to find a map, I forget exactly the time frame, but it was after they had met that the map was done, but it showed what the roads were like. And it was barely what you could call a road to go from one place to the other. And I said, so you need to look at another source. I said, where did they get married? And she was able to pull that up. She had her materials with her. And fortunately, the church was on the map. The modern, or more recent map, and also was on the map that we were looking at for the 1880s or early 1890s. That's the church. It was just a couple of miles to go down.
Walking distance.
So I said, that to me looks like your factor. I said, what you want to do is find out if that church is still in existence, if you can get a look at the records. And so she did. The church still existed. They had records. The two families walked, took the wagon, took the mule, whatever, down into the valley to the church. Social life of many of our particularly farming ancestors was a church. That's where they met.
Yeah.
We were sure.
Yeah.
But you have to look at what were the factors at the time, what were the roads, what were the chances that they could move. Was there public transportation? No. So
No, there wasn't. I mean, there was a train that went through there, but it wasn't really for passengers, and these people wouldn't have used that anyway.
Yeah.
So that and
so
that.
it's not like these two girls were going off into town.
Oh, no.
To pick it up. And more likely, or as likely, the soldiers were not coming into the town where they were living.
No, not unless there happened to be a relative who visited somebody and maybe came to the farm for some reason. Yeah. That's the only thing I can think of. All right, so now you're beginning to put this story together, but looking at what you can find about the epidemic, were there any other symptoms besides these respiratory ones? So I, of course, Googled. Thank goodness for Google, because I did have access to the National Institute of Health. Had an article on their webpage, and it talked about 3 forms of the symptoms for the pandemic. I'm saying pandemic because I'm not sure the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic, and we get it mixed up.
Yep.
And what do you think? But the 3rd form was gastric. And there's Catherine Arnold wrote a book called Pandemic 1918, and it describes people in the street with these gastric symptoms. But they're just mentions. There's never any more information. When you go in and Google that part of it, nothing comes up. It's all about respiratory. And the only thing I can think of now is to see if I can connect with somebody at the epidemiology department in NIH or CDC or someplace to see if I can learn more about the prevalence of that. And that might make a difference. What about their age group? Well, the CDC has one of the categories is under 5. Now, again, these 2 articles were probably written with a lot more information. It was written later after all the facts were put together, and lots of research was done. And so they may have information that wouldn't have been known in 1918. And how many people died? Well, again, it's going to be less than that 20 to 40 group because of the military records. But there it is. Now we have 2 little kernels of information to go on.
Well, and one of the things too that you might look into if you haven't is, has anybody for a thesis along the way done a study?
Right. And so JSTOR, and I'll talk about that in a minute, there's a website, there's a subscription-based resource called jstor.org, and we'll list it again. And they
Sydney has a...
Yep, they have all kinds of journals and theses and those kinds of articles that are not, books.
Yeah.
And I haven't found anything that gets into the nitty-gritty the way what we're talking about, but it is certainly something.
And I suggested that because a friend of mine's daughter, for her doctoral, did a study on the fluoride in the 1960s, putting fluoride into, and my sisters all took fluoride tablets for better teeth. Not that it worked, but...
Well, there's another idea then. The universities have those.
Yeah.
And so certainly you can get access. And I've thought about that too, that there probably are the University of Houston or University of Texas, those places might have something that would be maybe not just the average published thing. So that's something to look at. The other thing is, was there anything else going on at the time? Was this dysentery outbreak happening? And you would think about like the military camps, they had medication, they were on the lookout for dysentery, so they sort of kept that under control. Oh, yeah. This was a farm, I don't know, I mean, maybe the water well got...
Well, yeah, those kinds of things, and doctors were not, as you said, were not in plenty.
Well, they weren't knowledgeable yet.
They weren't knowledgeable, and they weren't, a lot of them, even if they were knowledgeable, to have access to them.
Right. So looking at the, sort of the broader community, how did the pandemic affect the broader community? And again, I think I've mentioned that the community did have some impact from the first wave, the spring wave of the 1918 epidemic, but it wasn't enough to sound the alarms until the summer, and then the fall is when that virus had mutated, and it was then really bad stuff. And then the third wave was lasting into 1919, but it wasn't as bad. I think almanacs are a great place to find information, and there was a Texas almanac that was 1921, I think, was published. And I looked in there, but they weren't focused on that anymore. They were looking at other things, so I didn't really find anything there. But if the place where you're researching has almanacs and they issue them regularly, that might be a place to look, because they're just a wealth of information. The town history, if you go to the museums or the historical societies, often there will be town histories where they name people and they talk about different things that really affected the community. That wasn't the case for this community, but I would think in general this would be a resource. Books. Golly, go to the Library of Congress, go to the medical associations. JSTOR is more journals. I found a lot of information that sort of corroborated some of this information from the NIH article about the symptoms. That was a book called Pandemic 1918. I mentioned it earlier, by Catherine Arnold. It was written in 2018. And she says there that this would probably never happen again to this magnitude. So here we are dealing with this. Newspapers, again, they really weren't dealing with this at all. In fact, they were more interested in the bond drives for the war. And newspapers have a tendency not to want to dwell on really bad information that could affect the economy of the area or tourism or, people coming to visit and spending money. They were, what I found more than anything was an advertisement for Vicks Vapo Rub, which was the panacea for everything at the time. That was going to cure your pneumonia practically.
Was even big when I was a kid. I don't know about your mother, but
it's still,
my mother had a jar in the medicine cabinet.
And it's still something today that we reach for. But anyway, that's what they, that's so okay. And then the military camps. Again, I mentioned that, and then any other oral history. So let's just wrap up this story that we've just written. Now, we've walked our reader through the intro. We told him what we were going to write. We started writing about what are the things that we knew and what are the things that we looked for and what did we find. And the conclusion now is that they very possibly died from the Spanish flu, but the conclusion would be based on, first of all, the least reported information and the least understood information of the day, and very difficult to substantiate. The truth is, more definitive information is going to have to be needed to determine the probability or the likelihood that they died of influenza, or maybe it was a different cause. So at this point, we can't say for sure. But we've developed a story now that our descendants can know about. That's more than just simply, 2 lines from an ancestor.
Yeah, there's the possibility.
There's the possibility. And so there's what we've talked about as a tool today for you to think about your family and dig into it a little bit. Write it down.
And a lot of these things don't just apply to medical questions. It can apply to any kind of a question.
That's a good point.
That you want to answer about your family. This has really been interesting. I need to check out more of what we're doing currently on the current pandemic, and I really appreciate you bringing this topic to us, Janell. It's something that we don't always think about these things or an approach to some of them. So we've got a lot of information that can be broadly applied here.
Well, it's my pleasure. And please visit our website, mvgenealogy.org, for more information about our pandemic collection of stories.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I just like I say, it's so important to go back and look at what historically they may